Hey guys, welcome back. I've had a lot of people ask about how I put my swell covers on in one piece without any kind of welt or relief cut or anything like that. And so in this video, I'm going to show you how to do that. Now I will say where you cut the leather is probably the most important part because we're going to be doing a lot of forming out of that leather. So we want to be sure that it's very malleable. It's not going to be real stiff. And sometimes even if you cut it out of the right location, you can still get a boardy spot or a spot that's really tough, which it's hard to get a wrinkle out or a bubble or something. But I'm going to show you how I cut that leather, where I cut it from, and how I prep that leather, and then we'll show you putting one on. And hopefully it'll go on as smooth as they usually do. Not every one of mine goes on that smooth. Some of them I've got to put a break, what I call a break on, and I'll show you kind of what that is too in the video. But first thing I want to talk about is on the swells. Depending on the tree that you're doing, I've seen people do, some really great craftsmen do like a Will James or a full association. I've done a full association before, or modified association, but it was a 14-inch front. I did do one time as a one piece. It took two of them, and it was way back when, but it took me 2 swell covers to get it on. Those are a little tricky. I will say if it's your first time doing a swell cover without a welt, I would recommend going with something like an OY. Preferably without leg cuts. This is an OY from Precision Saddle Tree Company, and it's got a pretty aggressive leg cut in it, and so that can cause a little bit of an issue. But the main thing is on the width. You want to be sure that they're 12.5, 13 would be my max on width of that swell to be able to do a swell cover with no welt or no cut in it, and have it go on relatively easy. Now if you're doing a wade or something like that, a really small narrow front, it's going to be much easier. Let's get to that video. I'm going to show you exactly where I cut my leather and go from there. Okay guys, so we're here at the cut table, and this is just a side of 13-15 ounce Herman oak skirting. Now this is a partial side. We've already cut off a cantle cover and some other stuff off of that end, and that's absolutely fine. You don't necessarily need a full side. What you do need is about from the middle forward, you're going to need the neck, the shoulder, and some of the middle, just to be sure you got a little bit of room to move around. So I want to show you real close on this leather kind of what I'm looking for. Okay, so one of the main things that I look for when I've got a hide up here and a side of leather and I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to cut my swell, this is usually the area that I will cut that swell cover. I used to cut further down into this armpit and have the gullet area right in this neighborhood. But what happens is I get one side of it down, of the swell cover down into this belly piece before the front armpit. And I found that just for me, maybe it was just the leather that I was using or whatever, but I found that area there was a little bit tougher to get formed really well on the swell. And so what I ended up doing, through some trial and errors, ended up shifting it forward to where one side is more into the neck. Even though it's thicker, it seems to form better and stretch, and kind of you can get those wrinkles out and those bubbles out a lot easier in this area than down in here in the belly past that armpit. So I try to kind of keep my deal somewhere in the neighborhood of, as far as my gullet piece, somewhere in the neighborhood of that armpit. And I'll let me get the pattern and I'll show you exactly what I mean on that. All right, so here is my swell cover pattern. It's really nothing special. I can give you basic rough dimensions of this so that you can make one if you need one. It's just a rough. This doesn't fit any particular swell. This is what I use for 99% of the swells that I cover. I just start out with this. It basically gives me enough leather to work with to make my pattern. I have begun to make actual patterns for a lot of our full association for swell forks and stuff like that, so that I do have an actual pattern for those. But I still usually just go back with this and then pattern up as I go along. But this thing is roughly 25 to 26 inches wide, and then the depth of it, including the gullet piece, this piece that kind of juts out here is going to be the gullet area that drops up underneath the swell, and that piece there is about 10 inches. You'll need about 10 inches there, and it's say a couple inches deep. So you need a couple inches deep, about 10 inches wide, right in the middle. Put you a center dot. That'll be for your cutout for your horn. And then as far as overall depth, right there would be about 13.5, 14 inches across there. So that ought to give you enough information just to kind of, and it doesn't have to be perfect, just get you something where you've got some leather to work with, and just round it off on the ends would be completely fine. I kind of wild cut that, as you'll see in here in just a second. But so this is our gullet area. That's the piece I was talking about that I try to put up here ahead, just ahead of this armpit area. And you'll be able to see the armpit area on your side of leather. If you've built a few saddles, you know exactly where I'm talking about. If this is your first saddle, you'll kind of look for the real nasty looking part of the hide right here, and you can tell where the top of the leg came out, and that's just kind of that junction right there, and it's going to be pretty trashy leather. So you want to be just ahead of that, going up into the neck, and this one side will be in the neck pretty much, and so that side will be thick, but it'll also form a lot easier than if it, down here. By the time, instead of being down here, by the time we skive it and everything, and then this side here will form really well in this area here. You could, I don't recommend turning it the other way, because then your gullet is going to be more towards the middle of the hide, still in the neck area, but more towards the middle of the hide, and this gullet area needs to stretch quite a bit to get bent around and then up inside the gullet area and smoothed out. So we want that down in here pretty good, and that way we can get around it. So I'm going to go ahead and put that there. So if you've got a lot of flanky leather like we see right here, this is real nasty nap kind of looking stuff, you can certainly move up a little bit. I'm not scared to do that because we're still in the vicinity. So we can kind of move up just a little bit, or move down this way just a little bit more as well. Either way you've got to do. And I kind of look at sides depending on what they look like. If I've got a side pulled out and that area just looks really, really good. This is buffed leather. I buy buff leather from Herman Oak. So they've kind of machined this to smooth it out some. Sometimes I'll be cutting other parts and I'll notice that this area right here is really, really nice. I'll go ahead and cut a swell cover and put it in the drawer down there just to have it for a future saddle, because I only get one swell cover out of each side of leather. So if I'm building multiple saddles, I'll cut one swell cover out of different sides. I don't cut more than one out of a side, because I really only want it from that spot. If we're doing it with a one piece with no welt or anything like that. If you're welting them, you can come down into the belly. You can kind of do that, stay out of the butt area still, but you can come down into the belly. You can cut it. You can kind of get one or two out of a hide and probably be okay, because you're going to be welting it and taking all that slack out anyway. If you're not welting it and trying to do a one-piece swell, you've got to have the ability to move that leather where you need it to move and form it around a three-dimensional object. And so we want the stretchiest, most malleable leather part we can find on the hide. And just my experience, this has been the spot where I've been cutting them. Some may disagree, may think that that's not a good spot to cut it. And if you've got a better spot or have a spot that you think works better, certainly let us know in the comments, because I'm always looking for an easier way to do this, because they're not always super easy. But we're going to cut this one right here, and we're going to go to start getting it prepped and see what we can do with it. Another thing you want to be sure and do when you're cutting these is make sure that you don't have any kind of cuts, butcher cuts or anything. The buff leather is just a cosmetic deal. If you're not ordering buff leather, I wouldn't worry about it. I'm not sure if they charge more for that or not. It's just something I order just for a little more consistency. But if they're out, I will use unbuffed. It doesn't matter. I haven't really noticed a big difference other than just the final finish color. You can kind of get a little bit more even oiling, I guess, or whatever. So I prefer the buffed, but it's not a mandatory thing. But you will notice a few less butcher cuts sometimes, not all the time. Sometimes it'll hide them, and then they'll show up later after you've already cut your pieces. So I'm not going to say buff leather is a way to go to prevent butcher cuts, but it's just a personal preference on whatever you like. But you can see that's where I cut this thing. I've got a little bit of shagginess right here in this corner. That'll probably get trimmed off, so we're not worried about that. Remember, this little piece here for the gullet, it's made longer for most swells. Some swells I've got to extend this out just a little bit, but for this OY from Precision, it fits pretty well. And a lot of this will get trimmed off as well. So you'll see that as we begin putting that together. And when you're cutting that out, obviously you don't have to be so critical to stay on your line. But now if you'll notice at the back of this, how thick that leather is right there. That's 13, 15 ounce roughly, probably. I don't have a gauge. I need to buy one. I've never had one. But that's roughly 13, 15 ounce, maybe closer to 13. But now if we go over here to that gullet area, you can see that we're probably pushing closer to 10 or 11 ounce, somewhere around there. It's quite a bit thinner. and it's going to kind of migrate and do the same all the way, you know, kind of a nice little gradient right there. And then from the sides, we cut this out this way. So if you look at that thickness there, and then if we bring up the neck side, you can see how much thicker the neck side, which is this side here, is from the side facing towards the belly. But again, in my opinion, and through my experience with with covering these swells, the thickness isn't so much the issue as it is the stretchiness. And the neck area is usually where you'll have more of your wrinkles, stretch marks, and things like that. And so that leather, you know, that neck area where the cow's head is always bending and moving up and down and side to side, it seems like that leather stretches and molds a lot better. The only thing you've got to be careful with, this is going to be a rough out saddle, so we don't have to worry about any marks on this side at all, because you're not going to see it. If you're doing a tooled, let's see, if we're doing a smooth out saddle, if you're trying to do a complete smooth out saddle with no blemishes and all that, you're going to have a tougher time cutting this one-piece swell out of a side of leather and not getting these big wrinkle marks. I'm not sure if you can see those in the video, but there's some significant wrinkles in this neck, and there always usually will be. Just nature of the cow, the way they are, they're going to have wrinkles in that area. But if you're tooling it, if you're doing a fully tooled saddle or a half tooled saddle, you know, half breed or a quarter breed where the swell cover is going to be fully tooled, then you don't really have to worry about it because you'll tool over that. So you obviously want to keep bot marks and cuts and anything like that out of there. But the wrinkles you won't notice as bad, and you'll smooth them out when you put the swell cover on. But like I said, if you're trying to do just a solid smooth out saddle, you're going to have a little bit tougher time. You're probably going to end up having to migrate your swell down this way a little bit to get out of the wrinkled area, which is closer to this cheek piece in the neck. That's just something you're going to have to kind of fight with, and I don't know a real good way around it, or just sort through your hides and find the one that has the least amount of wrinkles in the neck. They're not going to hurt anything. They're just going to, if you're doing a smooth saddle, those wrinkles sometimes will oil up. Even if you smooth them out when you put the swell cover on, you'll sometimes get a darker color when you go to oil that saddle, and they'll show up at the oil. You won't see them till you oil it. But that's just something to think about. I usually don't worry about it if it's on a ranch saddle. I try to make it as clean as possible, but they're going to mar that front up pretty quickly anyway, working out of it and stuff like that. And so just kind of go from there. But now let's get this cased up and let's go ahead and start skiving it, and I'll show you how I prep this. All right, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to take this swell cover and we're just going to put it down here in our case bucket, in our case sink, whatever you've got, whatever you're using to case your leather with. Now this initial soak, I don't case it up, put it in a bag or anything like that. I'll just try to get a good soak through with water. If you're real thin, like in this area, you might want to soak it too much. But we'll just get a good initial soak on it. I'm not even going to leave it in here. We're just going to kind of slosh it around, let it absorb some water so we can skive on it a little bit. And then if it's drier, we can always get it back in here. But we're not doing a full case just yet. And that's probably plenty. We can already see how pliable this spot right here is. You could probably put that on without skiving it at all. And so this whole gullet area is very soft, very pliable, and that's what we want. If you've cut your swell cover and this thing feels like a board, you're going to fight it. So use your good judgment, you know, after you cut it. I mean, you can see how soft and pliable that feels. That's going to go on real nice. Now, I don't know about this side, but it's thicker. This is the thicker side, but you can see it still feels pretty soft. And this side obviously feels really nice. I've got a little stiff spot right in there, but we're going to go ahead and start skiving and prepping, and we'll see how she goes on. So we're just going to start with our normal little skiving tool, safety skiver, and our little razor blades. Now you will go through some razor blades usually doing this, but just take your time. And basically the way I do it in my mind is I'm picturing the swell about yay far on the inside of this, because we want the top of the swell, okay, our horn hole is going to be around in here. We want this top of the swell to be fairly thick. It doesn't have to be full thickness, but we don't want to take it down what we're going to take down along the edge, because if not, they'll burn through it really quick with a rope. If they're roping a lot of cattle or doing anything like that, they'll burn through it. We want to keep the top edge of that swell with some substance to it. So I usually figure on you know, I guess that's probably, say 2.5 or so inches around is where we'll do the bulk of our skiving. But the first thing I'm going to do is kind of level this whole thing off, just so that we have some place to kind of go from. And so we're going to start here, and I'm just going to take a layer off of this entire swell. And again, there's probably many other ways to do this. Everybody's got their own method. I just wanted to show you kind of how I do it, because there's been a lot of questions on how I'm doing that. And some guys will fit these swells even when they do a seamless or a one-piece swell. They'll put this on there and fit it first, tack it in place, and then take it off, and then do all their final skiving and everything else. But this swell will only go on this tree once, and that's when we glue it on. I don't fit them on there and take them off and put them back on and let them dry and put them back on and take them off and skive them. We're just going to put it on. And when we do that, it'll either work or it won't. But I find that that's a way more productive process for me than trying to hold it up there with no glue. So when we put this on, it's going to be glued in place. This is our thick side here, and usually you'll notice this side is a lot drier because we didn't do a full case soak, and so you'll get skive down in there some, and it'll probably be a little dry. But that's not a problem. We're just trying to level this thing off where it's all basically the same thickness right now. You want to be careful when you skive the gullet area, especially on this piece. I'm going to, because it's very thin. And so I'm probably not really gonna level much on there. What I'm feeling for here is just any kind of thickness in this thicker area, and try to get it all. I just want it all the same thickness. If you've got a band knife or a fixed blade skiver, like a big wide 14-inch skiver, if you can fit it in there, and you got a sharp blade or a good band knife, you can level this whole piece off. And I would probably say level it at about 12 ounce, 11 to 12 ounce, somewhere around there, just so the whole thing's the same thickness. And then you can do your final skive by hand, and that'll really save you a bunch of time. I don't have a band knife nor a fixed blade splitter, and so we just do it by hand. I've been doing it by hand for 10 years or better now, and it works out fine. It just takes a little time. But we're not building 30 saddles a week, so doing one of these every so few many weeks isn't a problem. See, that is really soft. So I don't want to thin that up. You don't really want to thin it if you don't need to. You don't want to thin it too much. We want leather on the swell. We don't want a thin leather covering. We want some substantial leather on there. So if it's already pliable, then I would leave it. And you'll see that I burn through blades pretty fast. These blades are still good, so that's why I throw them in a little bucket. I save all these blades. The guy I learned to build saddles from, we used to buy these blades at Eckerd's. I don't even know if Eckerd's is still in business, but that's where we used to get them. And they come in a little injector blade loading contraption thing. It was actually for men's shaving razors, and so back in the day, and I don't know if they even sell them anymore or if CVS does or anything else. I buy them now online, and so it's, you know, razor blades are cheaper than labor. So once my blade starts getting a little dull, I mean even just a little bit where it's dragging, I chunk it and get a new one. Because my time's worth a lot more than that razor is, and I don't want to fight it. And my hands hurt enough most of the time anyway, so I don't fiddle around with dull blades on razor blades. But if you got to conserve blades, I understand. Best thing to do is to find a friend that's got a band knife. If you can pull this down for you, and then all you got to do is finish skive it, you'll be good to go. Okay, that's not perfect, but it's pretty level. It's pretty level. We're still just a little bit thicker right here, but right here I'm already a little thin. So I'm just a little thick here. We're about to take all that down. So we're not going to worry about that. So now that we've got it leveled, and again, if you're building on 12-ounce leather, not 13-15, you might not need to do this. If you're doing a rough out swell, I would suggest kind of skiving a bunch of at least the grain off. Don't go real deep, but just get some of the grain off, because it'll stick better if you've got this. It's not really rough out, but it's the split now because we have no grain side. We've taken the grain off. This is going to stick a lot better than your grain is whenever we do this application. And so I would recommend taking off just at least the grain layer or scratching it up. Either way, whatever you want to do. But if you're building on 12-ounce leather, you may already be this thick, and you may like the feel of that. It might be soft and pliable already. So like I said, don't take material off if you think it'll form, okay? And it's just going to take trial and error. But we want to leave the top, you know, about 2.5 inches around. Want to leave that thicker in the middle, and that way you've got some thickness on top of that swell that won't burn through quite as easy. They're going to burn through it no matter what you do. If a guy ropes a lot, drags a lot of cows, ropes a lot of steers, he's going to burn through his swell cover. That's just the way it is. And so just be prepared for that. Don't get your heart broke. Okay, so now we're going to finish skive. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come right in here in this gullet and from about here out. Okay, so you know, we've got to imagine the front of that swell is going to be right in this area right here. So maybe an inch or so back. So, you know, from about 3 inches, we want this down pretty thin. And then as we get back to this spot of about 5 inches, we want us to kind of start leaving that thicker. So you want basically a long sloping taper. We don't want a big drop off ledge. So I'm just going to come right here. And this is real spongy, so it's going to skive really crappy. But that's fine. We want it real spongy, because that means it's going to form really nice. Those wrinkles will just push right out. But it does make it difficult to skive, just because it wads up. I'm going to have to screw this bench to the wall here in the new shop because it's moving on me a little bit. I don't know if the floor's unlevel or if my bench is unlevel. Kind of moving around here. Watch your fingers when you're using the skiver. If you ever get your knuckle, it is almost impossible to get the bleeding to stop, because you're basically scalping it. But you won't bleed to death, but it does sting quite a bit. Okay, so that's pretty good right there. I'm going to call that good for the gullet. And you can see we're probably still at 3-4 ounce right in here towards the end. And I'm probably probably 4 or 5 ounce right in there, something like that. So now on this side, remember, envision again the same thing. You know, it's about what we want, something like that. And it's not a science, it's just eyeballing it. What we're trying to imagine is where the swell cover, when it goes down the side of the swell, where it hits the bar and then comes out. And so I'm going to say it's about right in that area. So I still want some thickness, but I want outside of that to be pretty thin already, so that we can get it, any wrinkles we can push through that thin area. So what I'll usually do is just go along the edge and take the very edge. Don't get too far in doing this, but take the very edge and feather it. So go all the way to nothing. And if you're doing this, you need to be skiving these. You need to be skiving everything really, either on a marble slab or a granite slab or a piece of glass. Because otherwise you're going to trash your blades if you're doing this on a bench top. Even that cutting board bench top, it'll trash these little blades. So we're just coming along this edge here, and you can see that's paper thin. We're just getting just along the edge, just that bit right there. We're just knocking that edge off. I don't really skive the handhold area. I don't skive it any differently than I do everywhere else. It ends up just kind of working out right, so I don't worry about that. The gullet area is really the only thing I'm kind of always real careful about. Remember this front spot right here, you've got to be careful and pay attention to your piece, and every piece you cut is going to be different. So don't take my word for it either. Like feel it yourself and kind of figure out your own system. But the one thing is for sure is don't skive every swell cover you do the exact same, because you need to keep continuously feeling of it and making sure that it's feeling right, and you'll get kind of a hang of how it's supposed to be. But this front corner right here was down by that armpit, and that is very, very soft, and it's really not that thick. It's probably around, man, it's probably around 10 ounce, and so I don't want to skive too much off of that at all, because it wouldn't take much to get that thing down to where it's too thin. And especially if you're tooling these, if this was a slick out one instead of a rough out swell cover. I've had flowers where we've skived these down too thin in the past, and I've had whole flowers pop up where they've ripped, where I cut with a swivel knife, and later on that saddle, that flower will stand up and come out of there like a hole, like a cookie cutter. And so you really want to give yourself enough meat on these swells. Don't get them too thin. Again, we don't want a thin leather covering over our swell. We want leather on it, but we've got to skive correctly so that we can get it on without any kind of welt. So I'm gonna leave that alone because I think that'll go. So now I've got a feather all the way around here. This whole thing, all around the edge, is super thin, about that far in, and it tapers up. So now what we're gonna do is just come in here on that 2.5 inches or so, or whatever, you know, we're gonna take and we're gonna start thinning that down. And we want a gradient. You don't want a hard drop off. We don't want it to go from, you know, 10 or 12 ounce here to 4 ounce here. We want a long, nice taper. And so we're just going to kind of start here, take some off, float it up, and float it out, and take off more as we come down. And that's how we'll get that exactly how we want it. Right here in these corners, that's where it's going to hit where your front concho is going to be, so you want to be sure that's nice and thin. And then right here you'll feel a bump, you know, thickness, and then right here it feels good. So we're going to go ahead and work out at that good spot and try to match it as we move forward. And then we'll feel, if you feel a hard spot, you might need to take a little bit more off. Just be careful not to get too thin. Depending on the way your leg cut is in the swell you're covering, if you do have a leg cut, you might skive a little bit further up in here, just the back side of where that swell cover, where that leg cut's going to be, just to give yourself a little more relief where you can push the excess down. You got to remember, when you're forming, tooling, or anything on leather, it's got to go somewhere. So that's the purpose of relief cuts. That's the purpose of skiving and all that kind of stuff, is that when you push that leather, try to form that leather, it's got to go somewhere. It can't just get squashed and disappear. It's got to go somewhere. So that's what we're trying to do, is give it a reason to go that way. So as we push it down the swell, it'll come out here to this thin and go out. What you want to feel for is you want to feel for little hard spots or thick spots kind of along this bottom. And just kind of lightly bring them down till they kind of feel a little softer. If they still feel pretty stiff, you might need to take just a little bit more off, but down here along the bottom, try not to take too much off here. Like I said, we want to keep it as heavy as we can and still get it on. But sometimes you'll get a pretty hard spot where that wrinkle, boy, it'll fight trying to get it to push out of there. Here, now we're getting into our thinner stuff. All I'm going to do is float this in just a little bit so it's even. It's not that crucial. It gives me a chance to feel of it and make sure everything's the way I want it. I think that's going to go on really easy. We're going to leave that alone. Okay. Okay, so that's our piece. It feels all about the same thickness. It's only thin around the bottom. And this gullet area, like I said, we didn't thin it down as much as we just leveled it off and feathered out this back edge, but it is super, super pliable. You can see why where cutting it matters so much, because the only real tough spot I've got that's not quite as pliable is right in this back area, which is where you don't want it. It's going to pose a little bit of a problem, but I'm thinking it's going to work pretty well. It's not that hard. So we'll see how it goes on. I got a little bit of a tough spot there, and I've skived into these before too, and there's been rawhide in there. Doesn't happen very often, but I have had some rawhide in my leather before, and that piece depends how thick it is, how far down it goes, and how much you want to jack with it. I had a swath one time that ran right there that was just rawhide, and I ended up just chucking that piece of leather in the trash and cutting a new one because I wasn't going to jack with it. Again, material's cheaper than your labor, so sometimes it's easier to make that decision than it is to sit there and mess with it. But if you're running low on leather, sometimes you've got to make it work, so there's fixes for that too. But I usually try to squinch it up just a little bit and just make sure I think that thing's going to form like I want it to. I'm going to turn this thing around. This is our good side. This is the side we're going to show the world. And so we want to make sure that it's clean. Now that it's been wet, some things don't pop up till you get the leather wet, and so kind of inspect, because we don't want to waste the next process in this. We don't want to waste time on something that had a butcher cut in it that we missed. So that piece of leather looks really nice. It's real smooth. Got a couple of deep veins, but I don't worry about veins. I worry about cuts. So I think we're good to go. Now we're going to let this dry. So we're going to let this dry. If it's in the morning when you skive them, you can let it dry all day, and then in the afternoon we can go and put this thing on. It's late in the afternoon today, and so it's too wet. We want it as dry as possible so that glue sticks really, really well. And so this thing is way too wet, and I'm not going to stay till 8 or 9 o'clock tonight and put this swell on. So we're going to let this dry overnight. In the morning we'll come back and we'll put the swell cover on, and I'll show you the glue process and what we're doing. So we'll see that in just a minute. Alright guys, so we're back in here the next day, and so we let this set overnight. I kind of put a fan on it this morning to finish it up drying, but you want to be sure that this front is completely dry before we move forward. So I'll usually, like I said before, I'll usually skive them either in the afternoon before I go home so they have all night to dry, or skive them first thing in the morning, and then sometimes, depending on your humidity of where you are and all that kind of stuff, it sometimes will be ready to go ahead and glue and put on right before you go home. It's kind of however you want to work that, but I would let them dry absolutely completely to where they're not wet at all. They're really dry, and that way we want the glue to stick to this leather really, really well. So we don't want any kind of dampness in there, any kind of moisture that's going to prevent that glue from sticking really good, because you're going to fight it a lot of times either way, and it's way worse if that leather's wet. And you're going to notice too, once this thing dries out, it's going to feel really stiff, and you're going to think, oh no, I need to skive it some more. A lot of times, if it felt really, really mushy and really soft whenever you were skiving it when it was cased, it's going to feel that way again when we recase it, because we're going to glue the back of this 2 or 3 times, and then we're going to recase it. So we're going to put it back in the water, and I'll show you that in a minute. But first thing we've got to do is we've got to cut our horn hole. And like I said, I've got a dot here. My pattern has a spot in there for the where the horn's going to be. That's where the center of the horn hole needs to be. So we're going to go ahead and cut that in. If you're using scallops to cut your horn holes, that's fine. Use your pair of dividers, wing dividers, and set your radius there and draw that in, and then punch those out. I used to do those too. Now I just cut it round smooth with a knife. I think it looks a little better, a little cleaner than the scallops, and so that's the way we're going to cut this. The first thing we've got to do is figure out what the radius is that we're going to need to cut this horn hole out for, and that's going to be determined by the horn that you've already wrapped. If you're doing a weight or something, this video probably doesn't apply. If you're using a big wood post horn, they're not hard to put on. You don't need to welt those or anything else. But if you're doing like a Will James with the wood post, it's maybe a narrower Will James that you're going to try to do one piece, then you're obviously going to have a lot bigger horn. Also, if you're covering, I measure every single horn. I don't have a set distance here for the radius of this horn hole, because all my wraps may vary a little bit. So we're going to check each tree before we cut this hole, and that front is for that tree, and that way we know the horn hole fits. So let's go measure that right quick. We're going to use these dividers and figure out what that radius is going to be. Okay, so we've got our tree here. Again, it's an Olin Young, 12.5 inches wide. I've already covered my horn. It's completely finished, sewn and everything. The wraps are glued down. So now we're going to figure out how big to make our horn hole in our swell cover. I determine this by loosening my dividers. I put them around the base of the horn. I don't go really, really low on the horn. I try to come up just a little bit to get the average width right in here at the near the base. And because we want it as tight, we want that hole around the base of this horn as tight as we can get it. But if you make it too tight, sometimes it won't slip over the cap. So you've got to kind of play with that a little bit and try to figure it out on what works best for you. But what I'll usually do is come up maybe, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch or so, 1/4 inch, but probably not that high, probably 1/8 of an inch from the actual base where it touches the top of the swell. Bring my calipers up, and I want the points of my calipers touching right in the middle of that horn. And then we'll lock it down there, and then I'll check from back to front to make sure. And sometimes I'll go ahead and suck it down just a little bit. Again, that leather will stretch around the horn, so we don't want, if you cut it too big, your hole is going to come out here along the outside. It's going to leave a gap, and you're going to get a little bit of that anyway. And I'm not the best at cutting these, so somebody's probably got a better way of doing it, but this is how I learned to do it and how I do it now. And so that'll give us a rough diameter. It's going to give us a full diameter of this circle basically at the base of the horn. And so now I'll show you how I find out the radius for the horn hole. So now that I've got that, like I said, that's the diameter, so that's not what we want. Now it's going to be a really big hole. So what we want to do is we want half of this basically, which would be your radius. And so what we'll do is this area right here is going to go drop down into the handhold, and it's going to get trimmed off and stuff. So I usually just do it right here. You can certainly do it on a piece of scrap leather or use a ruler and measure it. All I do is just come here, I press it down, make 2 dots. I don't know if you can see them, but there's a dot there and a dot there. And then I'll bring my calipers to where I think center is about between those 2 dots, and then set one end down and come around. So now I need to know I need to come in a little bit more. I'll do it again, and I'm right in the original dot. So that right there is exactly half of what we measured with these wing dividers. And so now that is the measurement that will go from our center mark. We'll put that in there, and then we'll draw a circle. And again, if you're using scallops or you know, like a half moon, you took a hole punch and ground one side off, so it's just a little half cut, then you can go ahead and cut right on that line, and you'll be fine. I usually cut those where it's kind of that line that we just drew is in the center of the scallop, and that'll give you plenty of room to fit that over the horn. We're going to cut this with a knife. I just think it's a lot quicker and it looks a little cleaner. You may have already seen the video where we showed you how to cut a hole, and I was actually cutting it in just a piece of scrap leather, I think, but this is how I cut my holes for my swell covers, or anytime I need a bigger hole cut out of something. Obviously I don't have a hole punch that's that big. They probably make one, but we're just going to cut it out with a knife. And so we'll take just a spike awl, drive it down into the bench where our center punch is, or our center hole. Then we'll take our knife. This is just an Osborne straight point, sharp point knife. And I'm actually going to set the point of that knife on the just right on the outside of that line we drew. That just gives me a little bit more clearance if my measurement was a little tight. And we'll drive our knife down into the bench as well, just the tip of the knife. And now what we'll do is we'll hold the knife and we'll turn the material. We're not touching the awl. You want to be sure that that's down in there really good so that it doesn't move. You could probably use a nail as well if you don't have a spike awl. And you want to kind of twist your knife to be sure you're staying on your line. Don't pull your knife out, but you can kind of twist a little bit because you've just got the very tip of the knife into the wood bench. And so you can kind of twist and as you're turning the material, and you can stay on, be sure you're staying on that line. But we'll just turn the swell cover all the way around. We're going to pull our knife out, pull the awl out, and we've got a perfect hole. And so that's a really quick, easy way to make a perfect circle in anything that you're working on. And then sometimes you'll have just a little bit of overlap. I just trim that out or sand it out, and that'll be fine. So now we've got our horn hole and we're ready to go. And we're going to do just a little bit of skiving here. We're going to go and edge and slick the horn hole and skive some of this off right here around the horn, because there is leather stacked on top of the tree. And so we want to take and allow a little relief right in here so that our swell is even. It doesn't have a big bump right there underneath the horn. They'll take up room and cause some issues. So I want to go ahead and skive some of this as well. So I'm going to take a number 5 edger right here, and we're going to go ahead and edge the top of this. You can use a number 4, whatever you're comfortable with. Whatever you've got is fine. I just like to skive that really well. And then I'm going to do the same to the bottom, but not as hard because I got a number 5. I'm going to skive quite as much, or edge quite as much out of there. So that, and then we'll go ahead and slick that area. Alright, now like I said, now we're going to come in here and just take off some leather right around the edge of that horn. You don't want to take a bunch off here because it'll tear if you've got a larger horn cap and you're trying to stretch it across there to get the swell cover on up over the horn. You will tear that, so you want to leave some meat on there for sure, but we don't want it as thick as this area out here, because we're trying to leave a little bit of clearance there, a little bit of relief for the horn wrap that's going to be underneath it right along here. So that's probably plenty right there. Just took a little bit off right along here, maybe an inch, something like that. And so after you do that, you'll get a little area down here that's not quite as skived anymore. So if you want, you can certainly come in here with another edger. It's not as edged anymore because you've skived it, but you can kind of catch it again if you want, or not. Just depends how picky you want to be. And I like to freshen it up just a little bit. Alright, so that swell cover is now ready to be glued. And this glue process is going to be one of the most important parts for me is when I put one of these on. And so I'll show you what we do there. Alright. Again, you want to make sure this is really dry. Should be. If you gave it a day to dry out, should be good. Got a little bit of gunk going on in our glue there. We'll just stir that around, and then we'll start putting us a coat of this on. The first coat is kind of just more of a prepping coat. It's not really gonna stick, so I'll almost on everything I do, I almost always use 2 coats, unless it's just something real simple and quick and I just need to hold it in place enough to sew it. But on these swell covers, that first coat's just kind of prepping that leather, getting it ready. So we're going to put this coat on here and we're going to let it dry really good. And so not for 2 hours or anything, but depending on what the environment in your shop is like, will depend on how long it takes. So it's really depends on your shop, but you just want to wait until the glue's dry. There's no wet glue left, and then we're going to do another coat. We'll actually do 3 coats on the swell cover and 3 coats on the actual tree. And so this is probably one of the most time-consuming parts other than skiving it. But the results that come out of it are worth it, so just be sure you don't be stingy with your glue. So we're going to do, this is our first coat, and while that's drying, we'll go and glue the tree, and we're going to sand that tree first. I'll show you that. Okay, so here's our tree swell cover, or the swells and everything. The rigging's already on it, the horn's already on it. We're going to take, this is just regular sandpaper, I don't know, 60 grit I guess. Any kind of sandpaper, just something to scratch it up. If you're working on rawhide covered trees, this is probably going to go a lot better for you because rawhide tends to take glue much better than fiberglass does. This is a fiberglass covered tree, and so you really, when you try to use a scratcher, like if you have one of these wire scratchers, they really just don't scratch the fiberglass very well. It's just the nature of fiberglass. It's, you know, pretty tough, and so I don't really waste a lot of time tearing up my scratcher trying to scratch fiberglass. I'll just use some sandpaper or belt sandpaper, whatever you want to use. But all we want to do is just scratch this tree up. We're mainly just wanting to take off some of the finish on this tree so that the glue will stick to that fiberglass a little better. Usually the glue will stick fairly well, but if you sand it up a little bit, it sticks much better. And the main area is down in here. Usually with my rigging, I've got some leather inside that leg cut, and so it's going to stick much better anyway. But we want to be sure and scratch everywhere we can with that sandpaper. The top's not real crucial, but down the sides is very important to kind of sand that up so that glue will stick really, really well. And you don't want to sand with like a power sander and sand through the fiberglass to hit wood or anything like that, obviously, because you'll be tearing up your tree. But we just want to lightly sand and scratch the top edge of this. So don't get crazy. And then we want to scratch up underneath there in the gullet area as well. And so just because that's going to need to take glue really well to be able to get this done. So we'll scratch in there as well. And I like to brush it off. Now I feel like I don't have to tell you this, but you might want to do this outside if you're doing a bunch of them or doing something. Obviously try not to inhale a bunch of this fiberglass dust. Just feel like that's common sense, but you know, I work with it all day, and I don't sand that much, and so we've got pretty good ventilation in the shop here and stuff like that. But if you're worried about it, you might want to do that outside just to keep. And if obviously you get it on your hands, rinse your hands off. Don't rub it on your arms. It's just like fiberglass insulation or anything else. That dust coming off, it will itch, and it's probably not a good thing to breathe. So use good judgment there. Decide whether you want to do it outside in a ventilated area or what. But now that we've got that sanded, we're going to go ahead and glue. Now I'm going to glue a big swath right here on top of my rigging and all the way around in this area right in here, all on the top. Try to keep that glue away from your horn here, because it's going to show if your horn hole stretches out. When you go to put it on or go to put the swell cover on, if it stretches out here, you're going to see glue right there. So I try to keep my glue, I try to get close enough to it that horn hole will glue down, but not so close where it runs up on the side of the horn. So you don't want to see any glue when we're done with this through that horn hole. So try to stay out there a little ways, stay on the flat all the way around, and you should be good. But we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to put a good coat of glue on here for the first coat, and we'll let that set up. And then I go ahead and come up the back side of my handhold here. It's much easier to get from back here, and then we'll get the rest of the gullet from the front end. And then I go ahead and glue a pretty good swath here on my ground seat, here towards the side, or coming down into it a little bit. I'll pull the tree up some and get underneath this gullet. And once we spread this glue, we're going to let all of this dry, maybe 10, 15, 30 minutes. It just, again, just depends on your shop and the environment where you're at. We just want it dry before we come in with the next coat. So we're going to do one more coat, and then we'll do a third coat before we put it on. So that's it. We'll let that dry now, and then we'll come back here in a minute. Alright, so this is fairly dry, and you can see it's not real tacky. That skive side of that leather really sucked in that glue, but that's good. It's creating us a water barrier, so it's kind of prepping this leather. So I got a couple little bitty wet spots, but that's not a big issue. We're going to go ahead and get our second coat of glue on this swell cover. It's ready to go. We're going to put a pretty good coat. You don't want it so thick that it creates a real thick glue layer in there. If you have any experience building boots or anything like that, and I do not have experience building boots, but my brother has built many pair of boots, and you know, we just want to use multiple thin coats of glue versus one big heavy coat, because especially on heel stacks and stuff like that, you'll get a glue line in there if you use too much. We're not so worried about that here, but just want to make sure that we get a good adhesion, and when this leather gets wet, that the glue doesn't just pull away from the leather. And so that's why we're doing 3 coats, because I'm going to do 2 thin coats to get a good base, and then we'll come back in with that final coat. And the hopes is that the water won't cause the glue to pull loose, because when that happens, it's really a pain in the butt. Because then you got wet leather and you can't get glue to stick to it, and the glue stuck to the tree. So, or vice versa, sometimes it sticks to the swell cover. So, it's kind of a process. Like I said, it's probably easier to go ahead and welt fronts braid them or do a blind stitch or something like that on these swell forks than to try to do it one piece. But it looks so much better when it doesn't have any kind of cut in it. And you should know how to do this. If you're, you should be able to do a one-piece swell cover on a swell fork. It's just a good challenge. If you're a saddle maker and you're worried about the time put into doing something like this versus blind stitching it, just charge more for it. You'd be surprised how many customers actually are starting to understand what a one-piece swell cover is. 20 years ago, they wouldn't have known what you were even talking about. They wouldn't even noticed it if you wasted the time to do it. And for the most part, some people still don't. They don't see that kind of stuff, but your colleagues do. So it's just kind of a fun thing to try. All right, so we'll let that coat dry, and then we'll go put another coat on the tree. And so our tree's fairly dry on that first coat. We'll go with our second coat now. Alright, second coat down. Let those two dry really good. We'll come back and get ready to start putting this on with our last coat. Alright, so that's nice and dry, so we're going to go one more coat. This one here will be our, pretty well our final coat. We'll do one that's just kind of a little slip coat. It's just a real thin coat on the tree just to kind of let that swell move around. I'll show you that in a minute, but right now we're just going to put one more. And this coat will be our final one. And you should have good coverage so that when this one is dry, we can soak this in the water after the glue's dry. And that glue shouldn't affect this, or that water shouldn't affect this glue at all. So it should stay on without much trouble and maintain its stickiness. And so we'll be able to go to the tree and start getting her in place. We'll let that dry and we'll hit our tree again as well. Okay, so we'll let those two coats, or that third coat, we'll let it dry, and we'll come back and get ready to put this on. Alright, our glue on our front is completely dry. Everything, this is 3 coats, it's completely dry, 3 thin coats. And so now we can go ahead and put it in our case water, and we're going to let it sit in there pretty good. You know, if you're real thin, you don't have to let it sit too long. We're not going to let it sit in here for an hour or anything, but we want to get good saturation of the leather so that it's all the way through, and so it'll hold its case while we're fiddling with it and trying to get it on the swell. And so with that glue layer on top, anytime you need to glue something down and have it be wet while you're forming it or do anything like that, you can always put a couple layers of glue on, let those dry completely, at least to tackiness, and then you can submerge them in water, and that glue makes a water barrier where it won't get wet. And so that's what we're doing here. And if you let it sit in here too long, like say an hour or something, you want to get it really cased up, super cased, or you got a really hard piece of leather, that water will migrate through the leather, get underneath the glue, and the glue will come off. And so I don't recommend leaving it in too long. You'll start to see, like here, you can start seeing some little dark spots where that water is making it through the leather, which is good, and that's what we want. But you got to be careful, because if it goes too far, you can get your glue released. And so we can already see now how pliable this is. And so hopefully, if we skived everything right and the leather is chosen from the right spot and everything's good, then this ought to go on pretty well. So that's pretty wet, pretty cased up. I'm going to call that good. And so you can see that's not sped up or anything. That's the normal amount of time that I've left this one in here. A different swell, a different piece of leather, you may leave it in longer, some of them may shorter. You just have to kind of eyeball it and see. The worst thing you don't want to happen is have it dry out while you're trying to put it on the saddle, and so, or on the tree. So you want to be sure and get enough moisture into it so you've got some time to work. So now we'll put that up here. And now we're just going to take some paper towels, just real old paper towels, and we're just going to dry any glue or any water off of our glue area. So we'll just get that nice and dry. Razor blades and paper towels, don't be scared to use them. So we're going to get this really dry, and you can see already it's still tacky. Still tacky. That glue is still sticky. But what I'm going to do, so we're going to call that good. I'm going to put one. Sometimes you don't need to do this, but every once in a while I find one I need to, and you just kind of judge for yourself. And I'm going to put a very, very thin coat, and this is just kind of a freshen up coat, a very thin coat that's just going to liven up that glue a little bit. Every once in a while when you do this, that glue will kind of make you think it's not going to stick real good. It probably will, but I like to add just a very thin, sparse kind of coat here, and that'll kind of freshen your glue. Anytime you're gluing something up like this, if you have to leave for the evening, you can put all 3 coats of glue on there and let it set overnight if you want, and then come back the next day and do a coat like this, or maybe something even just a little bit heavier, and it'll freshen that glue up from the day before, and it'll still work. So, which is kind of nice. So we're just going to put that on right quick. And we're going to let that set for just a few minutes. We don't want wet glue on the swell when we go over the horn, because you'll smear glue on your horn, obviously, and you don't want that. So we're going to let this dry to tackiness to where it won't pull off and stain our horn. Otherwise we'd be ready to go, but we're going to add this little bitty layer. So we're going to give that just a couple minutes to get tacky where we don't have wet glue to slime up our horn with, and then we'll move forward. Okay, so our swell cover is over there. It's ready to be put on. So before we put this on, we're going to go ahead and push this tree back onto our stand where it goes. I'm going to go ahead and put my strap on there, because we're going to probably be pulling and tugging and trying to get this front on there, so I don't want my tree moving around. So we'll clamp that in place there. And then I'm going to put, this is going to be a wet coat. This coat, the only reason for this coat is so that when we put the swell cover on, it doesn't stick automatically, because this is dry, that's dry. When it touches, it's going to stick. That's contact cement. So what we're going to do is put a thin wet coat. Once this coat goes on, we're going to go on with our swell, so that we have a little bit of time to move our swell cover and get our horn hole centered, and then get the swell cover straight. If you don't put that on there, when it sticks, you're stuck, and when you pull it up to reposition, you're going to pull your glue off your tree or off your leather. What we want is a thin wet coat that won't allow those 2 contacts to cement and to fasten hard to where we can't move it. So we want to be able to slide that around. So, but before I put that on, we're going to take just a little bit. This is just 5-eating saddle soap. The white is what I prefer. They used to make these in the little bitty cans, and now the only ones I found is the yellow ones. I would really like to have this white in a smaller can. These cans are huge, but they work. It doesn't matter. Same soap. I just like the smaller cans. But we're just going to put just a smidge of this around the horn edge. Trying to put too much, because you can kind of discolor your leather when you go to oiling. We're just going to put just a little bit on there. And that's just to add a little lubrication when we set that swell over it. The horn hole will go slide right over that. So what we're going to do is we're just going to put and it's not super heavy, but it's not super thin either. I mean, we're just putting another coat, but it's a wet coat. And basically, the only spot we're real concerned with is right here around the horn and along the top edge. You don't really have to worry about down on the sides because we want that to stick. When we start forming this thing, we want those sides to stick. But on this top edge, I want to have a little time to move around. So now we've got our swell cover. You want to be sure that when you put this on, that your gullet piece, the piece that juts out, you want that forward. I've put them on backwards before and they still work, but it's sketchy. And so then what I'll do is I'll just come in here, hook the horn, and then we want to just push that horn hole over that. If you made your cut correctly, it should fit nice and snug around the base of your horn. You want to make sure your horn's centered side to side and front to back. And so that little wet coat allows you a little bit of time to ensure that that happens. That you can move it around and get it right where you want it before it sticks. So if you're happy where it is, then I take and I'll come right here and push. I'm pulling out and down around the top edge of that swell, just starting to get a little stretch right there. But we want to be sure that once your horn hole's where you want it, you glue that down, push it down so that it stays as you're tugging and forming and doing your deal, that horn hole doesn't shift either way, that horn stays centered in there. And so we'll kind of start headed down, but not all the way. So now we'll do this side. We're going to come on this side and do the same thing. Again, not trying to distort your hole there where your horn comes through. And that little wet coat that we put in there is already getting tacky. You got to remember we got 3 coats of glue underneath that, so it's ready to stick where you want it. And so we're glued pretty solid right here on the top end. That's the easy part. So if you've got any little mishaps there with your horn hole, you want to go ahead and straighten that up, squish it around, get it exactly where you want it. Now we can start forming here. Now what we're going to do is you're going to work around and down as you go. You're going to go down, but don't go all the way down in one spot. You want to kind of keep going as you work your way around. Just push those wrinkles out and move along the side. If you go down too early and get too much of that leather glued down too far, then you don't have any place to go with the excess. And so you want to work slowly all the way around the swell as you go down. Especially when you get to that leg cut, you're going to have a lot of excess leather that's got to go somewhere, so you want to leave the door open, so to speak, so that you've got a place to go with it. And this is the harder side. You'll have one side of the swell or the other. The way I cut it, you end up with one side harder than the other. A little stiffer leather. You can plan on fighting it a little bit more, and that's the side I usually do first, so that I'm not overconfident and get all relaxed and then have to fight it at the end. And you can see how we're still real thick here. Remember where we skived? All this is still thick. This out here is what's really thin. But as we push, it's allowing that leather to go out, because you want it going out and down. Some people will try to gather all that excess and bring it up and shove it down the hand hole, or come over here and then work it all up under the gullet. And there's not enough room. You need it to go out and down in small amounts, not all in one spot, front or back. And it'll just take you a few of these, of doing them and fighting them, and kind of hands-on experience to kind of get to understand what I'm talking about. But you'll get the hang of it. It just takes a little practice and a little bit of feel to know what your leather's doing. And you want to try not to pull up and reset. You want to try to just get everything to move out of the way and slide. You don't want to back it up to here, because if you pull this up, it's going to pull the glue off of the leather or off the tree. Then you've got to re-glue, wait for that glue to dry, do another coat, wait for you got to start all over in that one little area, and that's really, really a pain in the butt. And I'm doing this all with fingertips. It'll probably lead to a lot of arthritis one day, but that's the best way I've found to do it. Now I'm just going to take this glass slicker, and I'm just going to try to rub out some of those wrinkles. You can also take your French hammer or just another saddler's hammer and pound the wrinkles out. If you've got a leg cut in your tree, like this one does, you want to be sure and get that rubbed in there really nicely and make sure that it's stuck really good. And make sure your leather is smooth and everything looks the way you want it. It is going to contract some as it dries, but we don't want to leave anything to chance. We want to be sure that we've done our part to ensure that it's all glued down. Alright, now that side is done. That's all glued down all the way around. We've got a nice crease. It's all up against the tree, and the leg cut, it's up against the tree up here. So now we'll do this other side. Again, we'll work down slowly and all the way around the tree. We got a pretty good hard spot right here in this leg cut, so I'm being very careful to make sure I get it glued down where I want it without having to pull it up, because on a hard spot especially, if you pull it away from the tree, that glue's coming off. So you've got to be sure you got it where you want it, and get those wrinkles out before you hammer it in there, because it ain't, there's no repositioning that thing. This front side of this swell is very, very malleable, very pliable. form this piece of leather around a baseball if you wanted to. Okay, so this side is done. I've got a little bit of a bubble right here at the point of that leg cut. I don't really need to, but I'm going to show you how to put what I call a break on there. And a break, I think bootmakers call it a heel break. But I'd started doing that on this, and it helps when you've got a bubble that you can't get out, but you're pretty close, but it just won't stay down, and you're worried it's going to bubble up or drum up overnight. The break basically mimics the seat that would come around here, but we're going to nail that in place. You may have seen me do that on an Instagram photo and not really know what I was doing, but I'm going to show you how to make one and how to put one in. Just like I said, this side I really don't need it, but I'm going to put one on. There's a little bit of a bubble, so might as well just try it, and then I can at least show you that, and that way you'll know that option as far as a fix, because like I said, one side will usually go on real good and the other side doesn't. So before we cut our handhold now, we've got to get our gullet cover on. So we're going to go to the bench to do that. So we're going to go ahead and take this out. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to make a cut right here where the bar comes up and meets the front of the swell. We're going to cut right in there and straight out. And we're going to do the same up here. Now it's the same thing, just underneath. Now you're on an inside curve here, so you're going to have a lot of excess that you've got to be real careful with, because the wrinkles are really hard to get out of this area sometimes. So again, what we do is we work it out side to side as we go in. Don't go all the way in with one spot, because you won't be able to get those wrinkles pushed out. Leather has to go somewhere, whether you're tooling it, forming it, or whatever you're doing. It's not going to disappear on you. You got to push it. You got to push it somewhere. Don't all go in that easy. But that's what a good selection cut will do when you've got the perfect spot to cut one of these. That's where it'll help you the most. Putting these on, in my opinion, is more where you cut them than it is your process for putting it on the tree. Why learning the different spots of your hide and where to cut leather and for different projects is very important. It'll save you a lot of heartache. And so I'm just using a porcelain doorknob bouncer and just trying to smooth that out best I can. That looks pretty good. And so then I'm going to come in here and trim this to the underside and backside of the swell. So basically where the handhold is and trimming that out. And we'll kind of skive a little bit of that off with our blade just so it doesn't make a bump. And that's pretty good. That cut, we'll skive all this down in a minute. Not worried about that right now. So now gullet cover is covered. Now we'll go back to the saddle stand and we'll cut our handhold. Okay. And once you get that cut, you may have to kind of touch up here the front end of your tree. A little bit of a pucker there where we cut that out and pulled away. Just make sure the front of your swell cover's back where you want it. Make sure we're glued up tight along the front edge of the swell. Now when I cut this handhold, a good friend of mine that used to work with me in the shop, Jim McFerrin, he showed me how he cuts his handholds. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to run that, I'm right-handed on this side. You got to do it opposite on this other side. But on this side, your handhold runs in an arc. I'm going to put this thumb on the inside curve of that arc up against the back of the swell right there. And then I'm going to feel for the inside edge up against the back of this swell and the apex of the arc right there, or the middle of the arc. I mean the corner of the arc right there where it meets the swell. I'm going to push my thumb up. When I do, I'm going to take this thumb and put it up against my thumb. So theoretically this inside of my thumb is the inside corner of that arc of the handhold where it meets the swell. So if we do that right there, now when I move my thumb, the front edge of my thumb should be in line. If I was to run an awl down in front of my thumb through the leather, I should come in right at the corner of where that arc comes into the back of the swell. So now what I do is I come a thumb's width, so this width right here, and make a mark. And so basically from right here is where I need to cut my handhold. So now what I'll do is I start low and come up to this corner right here. So we've got a corner right there. So I'm going to come here, pull this away so I can cut it. It's glued down. And I'm going to cut up here and then to my thumb thickness right there, and then kind of back out. It's almost like a teardrop cut. Okay, something like that. This will leave you enough meat on the underside to nail down and everything. And then what I'll do is I'll just check. Well, I look a little bit far. There's my handhold arc right there. I'm a little bit too far this way. So now I can come in, now that I can see it, and I can trim out just a little more. Now, the thing you don't want to do is trim up into this area anymore. This thickness is what we need, so when this goes down, we've got enough leather right here. Some people will cut this too high, and then when your seat comes in, you got to bring your seat up higher to be able to cover that miscut. And so whatever the thumb thickness is from the back of the swell, that's how far out you need to be. The thumb up is telling me where the inside of that handhold is right there. And then you can fine trim now that you can see it as far as what's going to be able to push down there. So now on this side I'll do the exact same thing. But now I'm like this. So I'm using my right thumb now. My left thumb is coming up. And so I've made a mark. That's a thumb's width away from the back of the swell. I'll start low. Come up here. Trim out. I can look at it and say, well, that's maybe just a smidge more. Now all that should be able to push right down into the handhold. Now we've got good coverage to cover that joint where your ground seat comes in, then your 10 strainer cover comes in. Everything's covered. And low enough now where you can bring your seat. If your seat shrinks a little bit, or if you miscut your seat and it's a little bit far back, you've still got plenty of leather here to cover that. Versus if your cut was too high, your seat can't shrink at all, or you've got to run it up the back side of the swell pretty good. So we'll get a good form right through the handhold area. Go ahead and glue these sides down. You can even take your hammer handle and kind of form that in there a little bit. So now that's ready to be nailed from underneath. So now we'll go back to the bench and do that. Okay, so we got our handhold in here. So what I like to do, and see we've got plenty of leather here covering this joint right here. So when your skirts are on there, you won't see as much of that joint. And so what I'm going to do is I'll draw me a line, and I'm probably, from the back of the swell, maybe 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches from the back of the swell into the gullet. But I just eyeball it. But I'll try to draw me a fairly straight line on this piece here, all the way across. And then I'll take a razor blade with a sharp blade, what we'll do is we'll take some escutcheon pins, whatever you call them. I've always called them escutcheon pins. But anyway, take those little brass pins, and basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to do one in the center, and then 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 is how I kind of do it. So I come in with this little awl that we've ground down, made into a kind of a nail starter or pilot hole thing. I'll start roughly in the middle. I come in at a little bit of an angle, get it started into the tree, and then pull it straight, where it's straight up and down. Drive it in a little bit, hold my thumb behind it, so I hold that leather tight. Turn this, pull it out, drop a pin in there. I pilot all the holes with these. The guy I learned to build saddles from called these cussin' pins because they've got round heads, and when you try to hit them with a hammer, you almost always hit your thumb if you're holding them, and so they make you cuss. So he called them cussin' pins. And so I don't like to try to drive those without a hole piloted, so that's why I do that. Keeps the cussing to a minimum. Kind of devilish little things to get into wood sometimes. Sometimes you can bend them around and get them to go in straight if they start out a little crooked. They're just kind of a pain. Got any hammer tracks, go ahead and rub those out now. So that handhold is nailed up. That one there I'm just not happy with, so we're going to pull it out. It just kind of looks wonky. See, I tried to bend up on me. I thought we got her in there straight, but go ahead. There we go. That one's better. Spot there with it. Take a rub stick, just kind of smooth that up. Now we'll go back to our tree. Our stand. Go back to our saddle stand. Okay, so you can see our handhold there. It's nice and it's really tight right there. It's smooth. We've got plenty of leather to work with here when our seat comes up. So now we're going to trim our excess off. Before I do that, we're going to go ahead and put that brake on here so I can show you what that looks like. We'll go ahead and put that on there. Now I'm going to get a piece of skirting to make a brake right quick to show you. Okay, so I've got this piece of skirting and I've drawn basically just like a rounded V in there, and these you'll have to make depending on what kind of tree you're working on, what swell pattern you've got. So they're all going to be a little different. I build a lot of the same swells, and so I've made one of these fairly often. I had a whole pile of them when I moved. I threw them away just because they had been used a bunch, and honestly was tired of packing crap. So then I'll do another V in there, just about like that, for this swell because of the leg cut that's in there. And I'm just kind of eyeballing this. You'll have to kind of play with it to get your own little style. So now as you can see, I've got this here. Basically what we're trying to do is mimic that seat. So if you've got a pattern for your seat for this particular swell, you can use that inside cut. That'll get you close. But I always just kind of cut those V's and then come in here and say, okay, well that's touching here but not there, so I'm going to cut some of this off. Kind of straighten that out. And now I'm going to go ahead and cut some of this off right here. It's not that crucial. You don't have to be perfect. It's just got to be close. All right. So now what we'll do is we'll punch holes here, here, here. Just space them out. It doesn't matter. I always just punch a bunch, so I've got a hole wherever I need it. So we'll take a number 2 squeeze punch and just punch some holes in there. Okay. So that's our brake. So that is going to go there. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to create, this is thick, this is 13-15 ounce. And so when we put nails in here, that's going to suck this piece of leather down, and it's going to push any little bubbles you might have. And then, like I said, I'm just doing this one mainly to show you, but I do have just a little bit of a spongy spot right here at the point of this leg cut. But I'm not really worried about it. If I was doing this without the video camera here, I would just leave it alone, because that'll suck up overnight. Because it's barely, I mean, you probably can't even see it on the video, but it's barely moving. But we're going to go ahead and put this on, and I'm going to go ahead and use the opportunity to be sure that that sucks up tight. So we'll put one nail here. You want to go ahead and drive it down tight. And then you can walk around here and put as many or as little as you want. I'm going to go ahead and put one there. And go all the way in. We'll pull this up here. And all of that is good. All that's good right there. And all this is good up here. So I don't need this done. But if your whole deal around the bottom where the swell meets the bar, if it's all loose around there, you can put nails all the way around here. The only thing you got to be careful with in my mind is that if you perforate that thing all the way around with a bunch of nails, I don't put nails in my swell cover. So because I don't like adding extra holes to the tree without having or without not necessarily needing to. So that's the only thing I worry about. But the way this is, you know, you could go ahead and add all these, and then what we'll do tomorrow once it's dry is we'll pull this brake off. So the brake's acting like a washer. It's not going to mark up anything. If it does leave a line, it's below where your seat's going to be. Everything will be good, but this will hold it tight while that leather dries, and it's going to cause it to, as it dries, to be sure and suck up to the swell. And so that is a heel brake, and that's basically all it's doing. And you'll be able to come up underneath this piece of leather with a heel pry or with a, you know, a tack remover or whatever, and you can pull those nails right out, and then they're done. And you won't see those nail holes because they're into the bar. You know, it's no different than nailing your front down. But that's the heel brake, and that just sits there till that's all dry. So now what we'll do is we'll trim all of that, skive it down. So when I trim these, what I'm going to do, if you make your heel brake too big, you really can't trim this yet, but we made ours just the right size. I'll trim matching whatever your cut looks like for your stirrup leathers, however you do it. But I like to leave that swell cover out there as far as it needs to be, really. I mean, you need some meat so we can skive that. And you can use a French edger for this. I just use a razor blade. It's quicker. We'll skive that side tomorrow after we take the heel brake off. Put this side here, so I'll usually come in here and trim out and around. This side will be a lot easier to see without that brake in the way. And I'm leaving about yay much. I don't know, inch and a quarter, inch and a half, somewhere around there. Just leave that leather hanging out. And then as I get back here, I'll follow my stirrup leather cut as close as I can. You don't want that being in the way, but I just think it makes a nice transition right there. Then we'll take our French hammer, nail that, or glue that down, be sure that's glued down good. Now we'll just take our skiver, and I'm just going to skive all that down. Try not to hit your rigging. If you're doing an inskirt rig, you don't have to worry about it. I'd take it all the way, usually on the inskirt, I'll take it all the way down to the edge of the bar. And then just skive that out. Then up here by the handhold, I'm going to take all this out. Be careful not to get too high. We worked hard to be sure we had plenty of meat here for our seat to cover, so don't get too high. But I want to get right up there where that handhold comes into the swell there. Take that out. And sometimes you might have some really big wrinkles out here. Just skive them off. You're not going to see those. Just make them smooth. As long as your wrinkle's not up here, you're good. Once it drops down to here, it don't matter if it's there. Nice and smooth, so as our seat comes up, there won't be a bump there or anything. It'll be nice and a nice transition. The seat will be able to come in there around the swell. Everything will look good. Want to check, make sure your glue's glued down everywhere, and that everything's adhered really well. And that's it. Alright guys, so that's putting on a one-piece swell cover. No welt, no blind stitch, no braiding. It's all one piece. Again, I wouldn't recommend this on any kind of swell that's over about 12 and a half, 13 inches, especially if it's your first one. It can be done. It's just a matter of, I would get a couple of these narrower fronts in under your belt before you try something like a Will James or an Association. But the same premise would work. The same process would work. It's just a matter of, I think the most important thing is where you cut it. And so where you cut it is going to help you more than anything else. And then skiving it and prepping it, if it's the right piece of leather, it's a lot easier to do that. But yeah, that's it. I mean, it's not really that difficult. It's a lot easier. I hope that you've seen me do one now as far as from start to finish and how I'm prepping and everything. So anybody that's emailed me or called and has had trouble with this in the past, I hope this video helps you. If it does, let me know in the comments. If you have any questions, feel free to call the shop, and I can try to walk you through any questions you might have and try to help you a little bit with it. I've had a lot of emails about it. It's just one of those things. It's really hard to explain the process through an email or even honestly over the phone. I've done it over the phone many times, but it's a lot easier to see it in person. So I thought about it when we were about to cover the swell in the saddle, and I thought this is a perfect time to get this video done. So because I hadn't even cut out the swell yet, and I thought it's perfect time to go ahead and make a video, and hopefully you found it useful. If you got any questions, let me know. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to sign up for the Leathercraft newsletter. We are in our new shop in Moulton, Texas, so be sure to check us out if you're ever in the area. Come by and visit with us. We're still kind of getting the shop set up, but we are functional. We are trying to get some work done every day, and I'm doing a little bit of work on the building as we go along, but to get the showroom ready and whatnot. We've got a lot of stuff coming this fall, hopefully that's going to be pretty cool, that I think you'll enjoy. So I appreciate y'all, and we'll see you in the next video.